Hold still, Omega the Alpha King whispered, and her knees gave out beneath him. From the cliffs above, the wind howled like the distant cries of the wolves that roamed the endless forests below. The castle of Eldrath, perched precariously at the edge of the jagged cliffs, stood as a dark sentinel over the land, a place of stone and shadows, where whispers carried the weight of both power and fear. Inside the grand hall, lit only by flickering torchlight, the court had gathered. Lords and ladies murmured among themselves, each wary of the Alpha King, Kaelin. His presence was magnetic yet terrifying. The air seemed to still when he entered, his eyes dark as obsidian, his voice low and commanding. Few dared to meet his gaze, and fewer still spoke freely in his presence. Today, however, a new presence had arrived. She was known only as the Omega, a woman whose lineage was whispered about in both reverence and dread. No one truly knew the full extent of her power or her curse. Some said her blood carried a shadow that could unravel the strongest man. Others believed it could heal what was broken, if only someone could understand her. When she stepped into the hall, the chatter ceased. She was unlike any courtier they had seen. Tall, graceful, her hair a dark cascade that framed a face pale as moonlight. Her eyes, an unusual shade of gray, scanned the room with both caution and quiet defiance. Even in the intimidating presence of the Alpha King, she did not bow immediately. Instead, she waited, poised and unshaken, as if measuring every heartbeat of the room. Kaelin watched her silently. Something in her presence stirred a feeling he had long buried, curiosity, and perhaps even longing. The Omega was no ordinary subject brought to his court. She radiated a quiet strength, a mystery that both challenged and intrigued him. "Step forward," he commanded, his voice smooth but edged with authority. She obeyed, each step deliberate. When she finally reached the center of the hall, she lowered her gaze respectfully, kneeling as tradition demanded. But unlike the others, she did so slowly, deliberately, not out of fear but with an air of quiet control. Kaelin circled her like a predator assessing a new territory. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the way she held herself, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the calm defiance in her gaze. There was something dangerous about her, something he did not yet understand, but he was drawn to it, unable to look away. "You carry a curse," he said finally, his tone a mixture of accusation and curiosity. "And yet you are here." She lifted her eyes to meet his, and for the first time the court saw her courage. "I do not fear it," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the weight of the room. "And I am here because I must be." The Alpha King's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It had been long since anyone had spoken to him with such calm defiance. He felt a strange pull toward her, not just because of her power, but because of the raw honesty in her presence. Before he could respond, a sudden commotion erupted near the entrance. A shadowed figure darted through the doorway, moving too quickly for the guards to intercept. In an instant, the Omega was surrounded, her eyes widening as the intruder lunged toward her. Kaelin acted without hesitation. In a blur, he stepped forward, intercepting the attacker with a strength and precision that made the hall tremble. The figure fell back, vanishing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only a trace of cold magic in the air. The Omega's knees gave out, and she sank to the floor, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of what had just happened. Kaelin's gaze softened slightly, an unfamiliar warmth breaking through the cold armor he wore around his heart. He knelt beside her, placing a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "You are safe," he whispered, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "For now." Her breath caught and she looked up at him, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and something she could not name. In that moment the air between them shifted. It was no longer just a courtly meeting. It was the beginning of a bond neither could fully understand, a connection forged in danger and unspoken longing. The court remained silent, watching this unusual interaction with a mixture of fear and fascination. Rumors would spread of this moment for years, how the Alpha King, feared by all, had knelt for the first time in decades, not out of duty, but out of a protective instinct he could not control. After the intruder had vanished, the Omega slowly rose to her feet, steadying herself against the edge of the stone pillar. "Who was that?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling only slightly. Kalen's eyes darkened and he straightened, regaining his commanding presence. "A shadow of those who would see this kingdom fall. You must be ready. Danger does not wait." She nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then I will be ready." The Alpha King regarded her silently for a long moment. He could sense the storm within her, the fear, yes, but also an unyielding strength. She was both a threat and a promise, and he did not yet know which would dominate. As the evening deepened and torches flickered against the cold stone walls, Kalen made a decision. "You will remain within the palace," he said, his voice firm, "not as a prisoner but under my protection, and in return," he paused, letting his gaze linger on her, "you will learn the ways of this court and perhaps of me." The Omega's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I will do what I must," she said. That night, when the hall had emptied and silence fell over the castle, Kalen stood at the balcony, staring out over the jagged cliffs and the dark forests beyond. The storm clouds shifted, revealing slivers of silver moonlight. His thoughts were consumed by her, the Omega who had entered his court not as a subject, but as something far more complicated, far more dangerous. And somewhere deep in the shadows, he knew that the curse she carried was not just a threat to the kingdom, but a challenge to the very walls he had built around his heart. As he turned back toward the empty hall, he whispered to himself, a promise no one else would hear. "You belong nowhere but here with me." In her quarters, the Omega sat by the window, tracing her fingers over the ancient lines of a pendant she always wore. Her heart raced, not just from the danger she had faced, but from the intensity of the man who had saved her. He was terrifying, yes, but there was also something in him she could not resist, a pull that went beyond fear or duty. Yet even as she felt the stirrings of something she did not fully understand, she was haunted by a thought she could not shake. What if this curse I carry destroys the very man who saved me? Outside, the wind howled, carrying the scent of rain and the distant cries of wolves. The castle seemed alive, breathing with secrets, danger, and the possibility of a connection that neither the Alpha King nor the Omega could yet name. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the cliffs, a shadow moved, silent and watching. The first act of their story had begun, but neither the King nor the Omega knew just how deep the shadows would reach, or how closely fate would bind them together. The storm was only the beginning. The moon rose high over the cliffs of Eldrath Castle, painting the cold stone walls with silver light. Inside, the corridors were quiet, yet heavy with a tension that neither the Alpha King nor the Omega could ignore. The events of the previous night lingered like a shadow, an unseen threat that had brushed against them both. Kalen stood alone in the great hall, his eyes tracing the cracks in the floor as though they held answers. The echoes of the attack still whispered in his mind. Who had sent the shadowed figure? And why had it focused on the Omega? For the first time in decades, the Alpha King felt an unease he could not crush with fear or authority. The Omega, meanwhile, had been confined to her quarters, though not as a punishment. Kalen's order was clear. She was under his protection. She paced the room restlessly, the silver light from the moon catching in her gray eyes. Her mind raced, filled with questions about her curse, the mysterious figure, and the strange pull she felt toward the king who had saved her. She had always known her life would be defined by shadows. The blood that ran through her veins carried a burden she could neither escape nor fully control. It had protected her at times, yes, but it had also brought fear, isolation, and the quiet knowledge that she could destroy those she loved if she lost control. Yet now, under Kalen's gaze, something else stirred, a feeling she did not dare name. The next morning the castle was alive with whispers. Courtiers speculated about the attack, some with fear, others with envy. The king appeared as if nothing had happened, his expression as unreadable as the still waters of a frozen lake. But the Omega saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers clenched and unclenched. He was a man who bore the weight of a kingdom, yet even he could not hide the stirrings of something deeper, something only she seemed to notice. "You will train," Callan said abruptly during their morning audience, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the court. "Not in the way the court expects, but in ways you will need to survive here." The Omega inclined her head. "I understand," she replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Good," he said, though his tone held more than approval. "You must learn to control what you carry. If the shadows return, and they will, you will need to face them without fear." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Fear had never been her companion, caution, yes, but not fear. And yet, there was something about Callan's presence, his intense scrutiny, that stirred a new awareness within her, a recognition that the stakes were higher than any she had faced before. Their training began in the castle's hidden chambers, rooms untouched by sunlight and lined with ancient stone. Here, Callan revealed the first lessons of survival, control, observation, and the subtle art of reading both friend and foe. He moved with the grace of a predator, his strength tempered by discipline, each motion deliberate and measured. The Omega learned quickly. She discovered that her curse, while dangerous, could be harnessed if tempered with focus. Shadows bent at her command, whispers of power that she could barely control yet could sense in every breath, every heartbeat. Callan watched her closely, his dark eyes revealing nothing. Yet in the quiet moments when her concentration faltered, he would step closer, his presence almost tangible. She could feel the heat of him even in the cold stone rooms, the weight of his gaze pressing against her back. "Do not fear me," he said one evening, his voice low, almost a whisper as they stood side by side in the dim light. "Fear the world, yes, but not me. I will not harm you, not unless I must." Her chest rose and fell with a slow, measured breath. "I do not fear you," she said, though the truth was more complicated. His presence unnerved her, in a way she could not yet name. It was not fear, but an awareness that he was a force as unpredictable as her own curse, and she was both drawn to and wary of it. Days turned into nights, and the bond between them grew, not in words, but in subtle glances, in shared silences, in the unspoken understanding that they were no longer merely king and subject. They were two forces colliding, bound by the same shadow that haunted the kingdom. One night, while the castle slept, the Omega wandered to the balcony overlooking the cliffs. The wind whipped her hair around her face, and the distant sound of wolves howling made her shiver. She thought of the shadowed figure who had attacked her, of the whispers that haunted the halls. And she thought of Callan, standing alone in the great hall, his presence a constant, unyielding force. A rustle behind her made her turn. Callan had followed, his footsteps silent on the stone floor. He leaned against the balcony railing, the silver moonlight casting shadows across his face. "You are restless," he observed, his voice low but carrying that same authority that made her pulse quicken. "I think too much," she admitted, looking out over the cliffs. "About what I can do, about what I must do, about what might happen." He studied her for a long moment, the wind tugging at his dark hair. "Control is not about avoiding the storm," he said finally. "It is about learning to stand within it. You must not let your power scare you, and you must not let it scare me." Her eyes met his, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them. Moonlight, wind, and the unspoken pull between predator and survivor, alpha and omega. Her heart beat faster, not with fear, but with something she had never allowed herself to feel. The following days brought news that tightened the grip of unease around the castle. A royal envoy arrived from the northern territories, speaking of rising tensions and the threat of invasion. The enemy kingdom had learned of the Omega's presence, and some whispered that her curse could either save Valoria or bring it to ruin. Kalen listened in silence, his jaw tight, before finally speaking to the Omega. "They fear you," he said, "and not without reason. You are not ordinary, but fear is a tool, not a chain. You must learn to use it wisely." Her resolve hardened. "Then I will not fail." Yet even as she spoke the words, doubt gnawed at her. Could she truly control the shadow within her? Could she stand beside Kalen without endangering him? Every glance she stole at him brought both comfort and worry. The king was strong, yes, but not invincible, and the thought of him falling because of her power twisted something deep inside her. Their training continued, each session blending physical skill with control over the mystical shadows that danced at the edges of her perception. Kalen pushed her, not with cruelty, but with the precise force needed to test her limits. And in return, she challenged him, forcing him to confront the hidden cracks in his armor, the loneliness, the fear, and the unspoken longing he had buried beneath his role as Alpha. One evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of violet and the first stars appeared, Kalen led her to the castle's library, a vast hall filled with ancient texts and forgotten scrolls. "Knowledge is power," he said simply, "and power is meaningless without wisdom. Your curse is not only a gift and a burden, it is a key. Learn what it can do, and you will understand what must be done to protect yourself and this kingdom." She knelt beside the massive oak table, running her fingers over the worn leather of the oldest texts. Ancient symbols glimmered faintly beneath her touch, as if responding to her presence. She realized then that her curse was not merely a shadow, it was alive, a part of her that could connect to the world in ways she had never imagined. Hours passed, and Kalen remained by her side, watching, guiding, yet allowing her the space to explore. There was a rhythm to their companionship, unspoken yet palpable. Every brush of hands, every shared glance carried weight, yet they remained careful, restrained, knowing that the bond they were forming could not yet be named. Suddenly, a soft rustle echoed through the library. Both turned, instincts sharp, eyes scanning the shadows. A figure emerged, one of the palace servants, wide-eyed and trembling. "Your Majesty, the northern scouts have reported movement near the cliffs," the servant stammered. "It is unnatural, shadows moving but no wind." Kalen's expression darkened. "Then the storm comes sooner than we thought." The Omega felt a surge of both fear and determination. This was why she had come here. This was why she had endured so many lonely years of uncertainty and control. She would face this threat, stand beside the Alpha King, and harness her curse for what it must become. A shield, a weapon, and perhaps, in time, a bond that could not be broken. As they left the library together, their footsteps echoing against the stone floors, the moonlight cast long, intertwining shadows behind them. Two figures, bound by fate and necessity, walking toward an uncertain future, toward the fires beneath the ice that would test both their power and their hearts. And somewhere beyond the cliffs, in the darkness of the forests below, a shadow moved silently, watching, waiting, and biding its time. The first threads of a larger danger were weaving together, and neither the Alpha King nor the Omega could yet see the full tapestry. The night was only the beginning. The wind howled over the northern cliffs, tearing through the forests like a restless spirit. The once calm kingdom of Valoria now trembled under the shadow of war. Scouts had reported movement from the enemy, forces gathering with strange, unnatural energy. The threat was no longer distant, it had reached the edge of their land. Kalen stood at the balcony of Eldrath Castle, the moonlight reflecting off his dark armor. His jaw was set, his eyes narrowed, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He had faced countless battles before, but this was different. The enemy was cunning, unpredictable, and whispers of mystical forces accompanied their march. The Omega approached quietly, her presence a calm in the storm. Her gray eyes reflected the pale moonlight as she stepped beside him. They are closer than we thought, she said softly. Kalen did not reply immediately. His gaze was fixed on the distant tree line where shadows seemed to flicker unnaturally. Yes, he finally said, and this time they will not wait for us to be ready. We must face them as they come. The Omega's hands trembled slightly, though not from fear. She had trained under Kalen's watchful eye, learning to control her curse, to harness the shadows that clung to her. Yet the true test had not come in the castle or in quiet chambers. It would come now, on the battlefield, where her power and her resolve would be measured against real danger. Kalen turned his gaze toward her. "Are you ready?" he asked, not as a king commanding a subject, but as a man seeking assurance from the one he had come to trust. She met his eyes firmly. "I am." The next morning the air was thick with mist and tension. Soldiers gathered in the courtyard, swords and shields gleaming, their breath visible in the cold air. Kalen's presence was commanding, every motion precise, every order given with the authority of a ruler who demanded respect. Yet his mind was divided, thinking of the Omega and the power she carried within her. When the scouts returned, they brought news that chilled even the bravest hearts. The enemy had not only amassed an army but had aligned themselves with strange, mystical forces, shadows that moved without bodies, whispers that could unsettle even the strongest mind. Kalen's expression darkened. "Then it is no ordinary battle," he said. "This is a test of will, strength, and spirit." The Omega felt a thrill of apprehension and determination. She knew that her curse, once feared and hidden, would now play a crucial role. She had trained to control it, but control was one thing, survival was another. As they rode out toward the northern border, the wind tore through their cloaks, carrying the scent of pine, rain, and the distant cries of wolves. Kalen rode beside the Omega, their horses moving in perfect synchronization, as if the bond they shared extended even to their mount. Neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. The tension in the air was enough, a silent acknowledgement of the trials ahead. The first signs of the enemy emerged as shadows among the trees, moving unnaturally as if alive. Kalen signaled for the soldiers to halt, his eyes scanning the terrain. "They are testing us," he said quietly, his voice carrying only to the Omega. "Do not underestimate what they can do." The Omega's hand brushed against the hilt of her dagger, but she did not draw it. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly, focusing inward, feeling the shadows within her respond. The wind seemed to bend around her, and faint whispers of energy rose like a song only she could hear. She opened her eyes, and the silver glow of her power flickered around her, subtle but undeniable. Kalen noticed. "Good," he murmured, pride lacing his tone, though he quickly masked it with his usual cold authority. "Use it wisely." The enemy advanced, a tide of dark figures interwoven with strange, shadowy forms. The clash of steel and the cries of warriors filled the air, but the Omega's focus was singular. She reached within herself, drawing the shadows into a protective circle that shimmered faintly, pushing back the enemy with both precision and force. Soldiers glanced at her in awe, realizing that she was no ordinary presence on the battlefield. Kalen fought at the front, his sword cutting through the chaos with a grace that was terrifying in its efficiency. Yet even he could not do it alone. The Omega's power became a shield for their forces, her curse bending to her will. She realized then that her gift was not only a weapon but a responsibility. Every swing, every command of shadow had consequences, for the soldiers, for the land, for Kalen. During a lull in the battle, Kalen approached her, his dark eyes studying her face. Sweat and dirt streaked her pale skin, but her gaze was steady, unwavering. "You are stronger than you know," he said. "And yet there is fear in you. Do not let it rule you." "I do not fear," she said, though her voice carried a quiet tremor. "Not you, not this battle, only losing control." Kalen's expression softened briefly. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You will not lose control," he said, low and certain. I will not let it happen. The moment lingered longer than either expected, a fragile thread of connection weaving between them amid the chaos. But the battlefield would not wait for tender moments. A new wave of enemy forces surged forward, and they were different, larger, more aggressive, infused with a dark, unnatural energy that seemed to mock the natural order. The Omega tightened her grip on her focus, drawing deeper into her power. The shadows around her responded, twisting and forming barriers, striking at the advancing foes with precision. Kaelin's strategy relied not only on strength but on trust, the trust that she could hold the line and that they could fight as one. Hours passed in a blur of motion, strategy, and endurance. The northern forests became a maze of shadow and steel, of magic and courage, where each side pushed the other to the limits of strength and cunning. The Omega began to understand her own limits, realizing that control was not absolute. It was an ongoing struggle, a dialogue with the darkness within. At one critical moment, a massive figure, larger than any ordinary soldier, broke through the front line. Its presence was overwhelming, a swirl of shadows and brute force. Kaelin met it head-on, his sword striking true, but even he staggered under the weight of its attack. The Omega did not hesitate. Shadows coiled around her, forming a living barrier that forced the enemy back. The massive figure recoiled, giving Kaelin the opening he needed to strike again. Together, their combined strength turned the tide, but the strain on the Omega was evident. Her energy flickered, the shadows trembling under the exertion. Kaelin noticed instantly. "Enough," he ordered, stepping toward her. "You have done more than your share." She shook her head. "I can." "No," he interrupted sharply, though his eyes softened. "Not now. You must survive. We are stronger together, but you are the heart of this battle." Her chest rose and fell, the realization of her limits pressing down on her. Yet even as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, she felt something else. A warmth, a tether, a bond that had grown between her and Kaelin. She was not alone. She was not powerless. As the enemy forces finally began to retreat, the Omega and Kaelin surveyed the battlefield. Soldiers were weary but alive, and the forest around them bore the scars of battle. The northern threat had been held, but the cost was clear. Both had glimpsed the fragile line between victory and destruction, and both had felt the pull of a deeper force connecting them, one that neither fully understood, but neither could deny. That night, back within the safety of Eldrath Castle, the Omega tended to minor injuries among the soldiers. Her hands glowed faintly with the energy of her shadows, healing where she could, pushing herself further than anyone realized. Kaelin watched from the doorway, silent and contemplative. "You are remarkable," he said finally, stepping into the room. "Stronger than I expected, and yet there is something more, something untamed." She met his gaze, a faint smile brushing her lips. "I am learning," she replied, "and I have you to guide me." Kaelin's dark eyes softened briefly. He stepped closer, the weight of his presence both commanding and protective. "Guidance is one thing," he said, "but trust, that is earned, and you have earned mine." The moment lingered, fragile yet powerful, as the moonlight cast their shadows on the stone floor. Two souls, bound by the fires of battle, the weight of responsibility, and the unspoken connection that had grown between them. Yet the shadows outside the castle walls were not done. The northern enemy had retreated, but their whispers, their unnatural power remained. Somewhere in the darkness, a figure watched, waiting and planning. The true test was still to come, and neither the Omega nor Kaelin could foresee the full measure of what was approaching. And as they stood together, side by side, the storm of war had passed for now, but the storm of destiny and of their hearts was only beginning. The night was heavier than usual, a suffocating darkness that clung to the forests and cliffs surrounding Eldrath Castle. Even the moon seemed to hide behind thick clouds, unwilling to witness the coming storm. The northern enemy had returned, their presence far greater than before. Whispers of unnatural power drifted on the wind, carrying a chill that set the soldiers' teeth on edge. Kalen stood on the balcony of the great hall, his eyes scanning the horizon. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready to act, yet he could not shake the gnawing unease in his chest. The Omega was beside him, silent but resolute, her gray eyes reflecting the dim light as though they held the moon itself. "They are stronger this time," Kalen said, his voice low, almost a growl, "and they will not retreat without a fight." The Omega nodded, her hand brushing against the hilt of her dagger, though her true weapon was far more potent. She could feel the shadows stirring within her, alive and aware, responding to the approaching threat. Her heart beat rapidly, not with fear but with anticipation. She had trained for this, endured countless trials under Kalen's watchful eye, and now the true test had arrived. "They will not win," she said softly, though her voice carried steel. "Not while we stand together." Kalen glanced at her, his dark eyes momentarily softening. There was something about her words, a quiet certainty, that struck him more deeply than any strategy or command. He had ruled Valoria for years with strength and fear, yet the presence of the Omega had shown him a different kind of power, one that was quiet, enduring, and impossible to ignore. The enemy approached as the first drops of rain began to fall, cold and sharp against the skin. Shadows twisted unnaturally along the tree line, figures moving with a speed and intent that defied natural laws. Kalen raised his hand, signaling the army to hold their ground. Every soldier braced, eyes wide, hearts pounding. "You must control it," Kalen said to the Omega, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "Do not let it control you." She closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. The shadows within her responded, coiling around her like protective serpents. She drew a deep breath, feeling the surge of energy, and opened her eyes. A faint silver glow radiated from her, a shield and a weapon all at once. The battle erupted with a roar. The enemy surged forward, dark forms clashing with the soldiers of Valoria. Steel rang against steel, magic crackled, and the air was filled with the shouts of warriors and the growls of strange creatures. Kalen moved through the chaos with precision, his sword a blur of motion. He was a storm unto himself, cutting a path through the enemy while keeping a vigilant eye on the Omega. She was everywhere at once, shadows bending to her will, striking, defending, protecting. Each movement was deliberate, graceful, and deadly. For hours the battle raged, neither side giving quarter. The enemy had grown bolder, sending forth a figure of immense size, wreathed in shadows, moving with a power that matched the Omega's own. It approached her and she felt the pull of fear and doubt, but she did not hesitate. Kalen noticed immediately, rushing to her side. "Do not falter," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You are stronger than this shadow. Trust yourself." She inhaled sharply, drawing upon the deepest reserves of her power. The shadows around her surged, forming a barrier that shimmered and twisted. The enemy figure struck, and for the first time she felt the full weight of her curse, an unpredictable force that threatened to overwhelm her if she lost focus. Kalen met her gaze, his own dark eyes unwavering. "I trust you," he said simply. Those words, spoken amidst the roar of battle, anchored her. She realized then that trust was a force more potent than fear, more powerful than the shadows themselves. With renewed determination, she extended her hands, directing the energy outward. The shadows moved like living arms, striking the enemy with precision and force. The massive figure faltered, and Kalen seized the opportunity to strike, his blade piercing through the darkness and dispersing it. The soldiers cheered, but the battle was not over. More forces pressed forward, and the Omega felt the exhaustion creeping in. Every movement required focus, every strike demanded energy, and every breath tested her resolve. She glanced at Kalen, seeing him fight not just with strength, but with strategy, guiding the soldiers and protecting her at every turn. In that moment, The unspoken bond between them crystallized. They were not merely allies, they were forces intertwined, each completing the other. The Alpha King and the Omega, bound by duty, courage, and something far deeper that neither dared name aloud. Hours passed like minutes. The rain fell harder, turning the battlefield into mud, but neither side relented. Then, just as hope seemed to waver, the enemy's forces began to falter. The figure of immense shadow had been vanquished, and the remaining soldiers, seeing their leader defeated, retreated into the forest, leaving only whispers of their presence behind. The battlefield fell silent, save for the rain and the distant howls of wolves. The Omega sank to her knees, drained but alive, her shadows retracting like obedient servants. Kalen was immediately at her side, steadying her, his strong hands on her shoulders. "You did it," he said, his voice low, filled with admiration and something more, something raw and unspoken. She looked up at him, her gray eyes shimmering with rain and exhaustion. "We did it," she corrected gently, knowing that neither could have survived alone. He studied her face, the silver light of the storm casting a glow across her features. "Yes, together," he murmured. The words carried a weight neither of them could ignore. The two returned to the castle, the night air heavy but less threatening now. Inside, the soldiers tended to their wounds, the echoes of battle replaced with the quiet rhythm of recovery. Yet even in the relative safety of the castle, the bond forged in fire and shadow lingered, unspoken but undeniable. Later, in the quiet of the great hall, Kalen approached the Omega. She was seated on the floor, her cloak damp, her expression weary but determined. He knelt before her, his dark eyes searching hers. "You are remarkable," he said simply. "Not only for your strength, but for your courage, your control, your heart." Her lips curved into a faint smile, a mixture of relief and something deeper. "I learned from the best," she replied softly, her hand brushing his sleeve. Kalen's gaze softened, his usual authority giving way to something more personal, more intimate. "Do not hide from me," he whispered. "I see you, all of you, and I do not fear what I see." Her breath caught, and she felt the warmth of his presence surround her. The shadows within her no longer felt like a burden. They were a part of her, a force she could wield, strengthened by his trust in their bond. Outside, the storm began to break, the clouds parting to reveal the pale light of dawn. The castle, scarred but standing, reflected the resilience of its defenders. The Alpha King and the Omega stood together, looking out over the cliffs, the weight of victory and the promise of something more in their hearts. Kalen reached out, taking her hand gently. "Hold still," he whispered, his voice a low, tender command. "Only here, only us." The Omega's knees trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment. She allowed herself to be held, to feel the strength and warmth of the man who had become both protector and equal. "I will," she whispered back, her voice steady despite the rush of emotion. And in that shared silence, the world seemed to pause. The storm had passed, the shadows had retreated, and two souls, bound by trials and destiny, found in each other a strength that neither could have discovered alone. The kingdom of Veloria would continue to face challenges, of course, and the shadows of the past would never fully vanish. But in that moment, the Alpha King and the Omega had learned something vital. That power, courage, and even curses were nothing without trust, connection, and the willingness to stand together against the darkness. As the sun rose over the cliffs, painting the sky with gold and rose, Kalen and the Omega remained on the balcony, hand in hand, hearts beating in quiet harmony. They had survived the fires of battle, the weight of destiny, and the pull of their own inner darkness. And in each other they had found not only survival, but redemption, strength, and the first whisper of love that needed no name to exist. The story of the Alpha King and the Omega would be remembered in the legends of Veloria, a tale of shadows and courage, of power and trust, of hearts that learned to hold fast even when the world threatened to tear them apart. And though the future remained uncertain, one truth endured. Together they were unstoppable. The storm had ended. The shadows had retreated. And the bond between King and Omega, forged in fire, shadow, and whispered promises, would never be broken.